Handcuffs clinked against the heavy oak of the defense table. Officer Bradley Jenkins smirked, nudging his partner as they stared at the quiet, unassuming black man in a frayed thrift store suit. They thought they had bagged another easy, voiceless target. They didn't know they had just arrested the director of the FBI. Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry hornets in Cook County Circuit Courtroom 302. Roy Jassen sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He wore a faded gray suit that looked 2 sizes too big, the fabric thinning at the elbows. To anyone else in the gallery, he was just another statistic, another middle-aged black man caught in the unforgiving, revolving door of Chicago's criminal justice system. Beside him, David Ross, an overworked public defender with mustard stains on his lapel, frantically shuffled through a remarkably thin manila folder. "Look, Mr. Jassen," Ross whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee and defeat. "Assistant District Attorney Hayes is offering a sweet deal. Plead guilty to resisting arrest, and the unregistered firearm charge gets dropped to a misdemeanor. 6 months of probation. You walk out of here today. If we go to trial, Judge Carmichael is going to throw the book at you." Roy didn't look at his lawyer. His piercing gaze was locked on the prosecution's table, where Officer Bradley Jenkins and Sergeant Thomas Miller sat. Jenkins, a burly man with a flushed neck and a tight fade haircut, leaned back in his chair, whispering something behind his hand to Miller. Miller, older and sporting a salt and pepper mustache, chuckled darkly, his eyes darting toward Roy with undisguised contempt. "I will not take a plea, David," Roy said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that commanded the space around him, a voice entirely out of place for a supposedly broken man facing prison time. "I am not guilty." "Nobody in here is guilty," Ross sighed, rubbing his temples with trembling fingers. "But Miller and Jenkins are decorated veterans of the South Side precinct. The judge loves them. Juries love them. You were driving a beat-up 1998 Honda Civic at 2 in the morning in a high-crime neighborhood. They say you swerved. They say you smelled like alcohol. They say you reached for your waistband when they asked for ID. It's your word against 2 shiny silver badges." Roy finally turned to look at Ross, his expression unreadable. Their cruiser's dash cam was inexplicably turned off. Their body cameras malfunctioned at the exact same moment. "Does that not strike you as statistically improbable?" Ross let out a harsh bark of a laugh. "Improbable? Sure. Unheard of? Happens every Tuesday in this building. Please, Roy. I have 60 other cases today. Just take the plea. You don't want to play chicken with these cops." "I am not playing," Roy replied quietly. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, cutting off Ross's frantic protests. Judge Patricia Carmichael swept into the room, her black robe billowing behind her like a storm cloud. She was a notoriously no-nonsense jurist who prided herself on clearing dockets with ruthless efficiency. She took her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and peered over the massive mahogany bench. "Docket number 44-092, State of Illinois versus Roy Jassen," Judge Carmichael announced, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Charges: driving under the influence, resisting arrest, and possession of an unlicensed firearm. Mr. Ross, I see we were scheduled for a plea agreement this morning." Ross stood up, looking utterly miserable. "Your Honor, the defense. The defense respectfully declines the state's offer. We are prepared to go to trial." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Assistant District Attorney Richard Hayes, a young prosecutor with slicked-back hair and a sharp, tailored suit, blinked in surprise, then smiled like a shark smelling blood in the water. At the prosecution table, Jenkins openly laughed, leaning over to whisper loud enough for the court reporter to hear, "Guess the old man wants to do a 5-piece in Stateville." "Silence in the court," Carmichael snapped, though her icy glare was directed entirely at the defense table. "Mr. Jassen, you understand that by rejecting this plea, you face up to 5 years in state prison if convicted by a jury?" "I understand the parameters perfectly, Your Honor," Roy replied, standing tall. His grammar was precise, his tone entirely devoid of the expected panic. Carmichael frowned, clearly irritated by the delay. "Very well. Mr. Hayes, call your first witness. The state calls Officer Bradley Jenkins to the stand. Hayes announced smoothly, unbuttoning his jacket. Jenkins swaggered to the witness box. He took the oath with a bored, practiced expression, settling into the chair and adjusting his microphone. He looked directly at Roy and offered a faint, mocking smile. It was the look of a predator playing with its food. Officer Jenkins, Hayes began, pacing confidently in front of the jury box. Can you tell us what happened on the night of October 14th? Certainly, Jenkins replied, his tone rehearsed. My partner, Sergeant Miller, and I were on routine patrol down near 55th and Halstead. High crime area, heavy gang activity. Around 0200 hours, we observed a 1,998 silver Honda Civic drifting erratically across the center line. Suspecting an impaired driver, we initiated a routine traffic stop. And how did the defendant react to this lawful stop? Hayes prompted. Hostile right out of the gate, Jenkins lied without blinking. Before I even reached the driver's side window, he was screaming obscenities. I smelled a strong, distinct odor of intoxicants emanating from the cabin. When I ordered him to step out of the vehicle for a sobriety test, he refused. He then made a sudden, aggressive movement toward his waistband. Roy listened to the brazen perjury with an unsettling calmness. He didn't fidget. He didn't shake his head in denial. He simply watched Jenkins with the cold, analytical gaze of a man memorizing every detail of his enemy's misstep. Fearing for my life, and the life of my partner, Jenkins continued, placing a hand over his heart in a sickening display of false valor. We forcibly extracted the suspect from the vehicle. During the ensuing struggle, a loaded .38 caliber revolver fell from his person onto the pavement. Thank you, officer, Hayes said, turning to give Ross a pitying look. Your witness. David Ross stood up, his hands visibly shaking as he grabbed his yellow legal pad. He walked to the podium, clearing his throat nervously. Officer Jenkins, you testified that Mr. Jason was highly intoxicated. Yet, the breathalyzer report administered at the station showed a blood alcohol content of 0. How do you explain that discrepancy? Jenkins shrugged, entirely unbothered. Sometimes those older machines need recalibration. Or maybe he was high on narcotics. He was definitely acting erratic. My training tells me when someone is under the influence. And the dash cam? Ross pressed, his voice lacking any real conviction. Why wasn't it active during this encounter? Mechanical failure, Jenkins said smoothly. Fleet maintenance in the 9th District has been a nightmare lately due to budget cuts. We reported it broken to the motor pool at the start of our shift. No further questions, Ross mumbled, retreating to his seat like a beaten dog. He leaned over to Roy, shielding his mouth with his hand. I told you, they have an answer for everything. You're going down, Roy. Roy remained silent as Sergeant Thomas Miller was called to the stand next. Miller corroborated every single word Jenkins said, seamlessly backing up his partner's narrative, while adding a few colorful embellishments about Roy supposedly threatening to kill some cops. The jury, leaning in, allowed their expressions to harden toward the defendant. Sergeant Miller, Ada Hayes asked, leaning against the podium, is there any doubt in your mind whatsoever that the illegal weapon recovered that night belonged to the defendant? None at all, Miller sneered, locking eyes with Roy. He's exactly the kind of violent thug we're trying to clear off these streets. Just another career criminal trying to hide behind a cheap suit. Objection, Ross half-heartedly muttered from his chair. Sustained. Watch your phrasing, Sergeant, Judge Carmichael warned lightly, though her tone lacked any real reprimand. Your witness, Hayes said, returning to his seat with a triumphant smirk. Ross didn't even bother to stand up. No questions for this witness, Your Honor. Roy moved. He placed a hand firmly over Ross's wrist. The public defender flinched at the sudden iron-like grip. Your Honor, Roy spoke up, his booming voice cutting through the stuffy air of the courtroom and silencing the murmuring gallery. If my appointed counsel refuses to properly cross-examine this witness, I formally request to represent myself. Pro se, Judge Carmichael sighed heavily, rubbing her temples as if Roy was giving her a migraine. Mr. Jason, you have a constitutional right to self-representation, but I strongly advise against it. You do not know the rules of evidence. You will hold yourself to the exact same rigorous standards as a barred attorney. I am fully prepared to meet those standards, Your Honor, Roy replied, standing up and calmly buttoning his frayed suit jacket. At the prosecution table, Jenkins and Miller exchanged a highly amused look. A pro se defendant was a dirty cop's favorite chew toy. It usually resulted in a frustrated screaming match, an easy contempt of court charge, and a guaranteed, fast-tracked guilty verdict. Very well, Mr. Ross, you will remain seated as standby counsel, Carmichael ordered. Mr. Jasson, you may begin your cross-examination. Keep it relevant. Roy walked out from behind the defense table. He didn't carry a legal pad. He didn't look nervous. He walked with a measured, deliberate stride that commanded an immediate, unexpected gravity in the room. He stood directly before the witness stand, looking up at Sergeant Miller. For a brief, fleeting second, Miller felt a strange, icy prickle of warning at the back of his neck. Sergeant Miller, Roy began, his tone polite, yet dangerously sharp. You testified under oath that your vehicle's dash cam was reported broken at the start of your shift, a shift that began at 2,000 hours. Is that correct? Yeah, that's right, Miller said, crossing his thick arms over his chest. Are you familiar with the Chicago Police Department's standard operating procedure, specifically General Order 13-02, regarding mobile video equipment? Miller frowned. Ada Hayes looked up from his notes, his brow suddenly furrowing. I know the patrol procedures, Miller grunted defensively. Then you know, Roy continued, pacing slowly across the well of the court, that General Order 13-02 explicitly states that no unit shall be deployed for active patrol if the mobile video equipment is non-functional. The vehicle must be grounded immediately, and a replacement vehicle issued. Did you request a replacement vehicle, Sergeant? Objection. Relevance, Hayes called out, standing up quickly. Overruled, Judge Carmichael said, sitting forward, suddenly looking intrigued by the defendant's precise knowledge of police codes. You may answer the question, Sergeant. There were no other cars available, Miller stammered, his confident swagger slipping just a fraction. No other cars available in the entire 9th District motor pool? Roy raised a skeptical eyebrow. How fascinating. Especially since the district dispatch logs from that exact evening show 12 unassigned, fully functional patrol cruisers sitting idle in the lot. Miller's face flushed a deep, angry red. I don't know about the dispatch logs. I just know what the desk sergeant told us. Let's move to the weapon, Roy pivoted smoothly, flawlessly transitioning before Miller had time to recover his footing. A. .38 caliber revolver. Serial number scratched off. You claim it fell from my waistband. Did you run the weapon for fingerprints? We didn't need to, Miller scoffed, regaining some of his bravado. We saw it fall right off you. You didn't need to? Roy's voice dropped an octave, the entire courtroom hanging on his every calculated word. Or did you explicitly order the crime lab not to test it? Because standard CPD protocol dictates all recovered firearms be processed for latent prints and DNA. Yet, the evidence chain of custody report indicates an override authorization was used, an authorization signed by you. A dead, heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Jenkins stopped smirking entirely. Ada Hayes frantically flipped through his thick case file, his face paling as he realized he had missed this critical detail. It was an open and shut case, Miller growled, leaning forward aggressively. Forensic testing costs the taxpayers money. You are very protective of taxpayer money, Sergeant, Roy observed coolly, though perhaps significantly less protective of their civil rights. You claim I was belligerent and smelled of alcohol. You also claimed I was swerving erratically. However, you stated the arrest took place exactly at the intersection of 55th and Halsted. Can you describe that intersection for the jury? It's a four-way stop with a standard traffic light, Miller snapped. Is there a city halo surveillance camera at that intersection? No, Miller answered confidently. He knew all the camera blind spots in his district. That was precisely why he and Jenkins picked that specific, unmonitored corner for their illegal shakedowns. You are correct. There is no city camera, Roy smiled. It was a terrifying, chilling smile. But there is an ATM camera at the Bank of America on the northeast corner. A camera that points directly at the street. A camera that I subpoenaed 3 days ago. Miller froze completely. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly. At the prosecution table, Jenkins looked like he was about to be physically ill. Roy turned his back on the terrified cops and faced the judge. Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence Defense Exhibit A, a digital recording from the Bank of America ATM, timestamped 2:04 a.m. on October 14th. Objection, Hayes shouted, jumping to his feet in a blind panic. The state was not provided with this so-called evidence during the discovery phase. With all due respect, Your Honor, Roy countered smoothly, pulling a court-stamped document from his breast pocket. I filed the supplemental discovery motion with the clerk's office 72 hours ago, and a certified copy was delivered to the district attorney's office. If Mr. Hayes failed to review his incoming mail, that is not the defense's burden to bear. Judge Carmichael tapped her touchscreen monitor, her eyes widening slightly as she read. He's right, Mr. Hayes. The filing is right here in the system. I will allow it. Roy walked over to the courtroom's media cart, plugging in a small, encrypted USB drive. He didn't just have a defense. He was building a steel trap, and these two corrupt officers had just walked blindly into the jaws. Light from the courtroom's overhead projector cut through the dusty air, illuminating the large pull-down screen positioned perfectly in front of the jury box. The Bank of America logo glowed in the top right corner of the video feed, sitting just above a stark, white timestamp. October 14, 2:01 and 15 seconds a.m. Roy Jasson stood beside the media cart, his posture still impossibly straight despite the baggy, ill-fitting suit. He held a small remote control in his right hand. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Richard Hayes was furiously tapping his Mont Blanc pen against his legal pad, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw. On the witness stand, Sergeant Thomas Miller sat rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden railing. Sergeant Miller, Roy's voice resonated, calm and chillingly authoritative. I direct your attention to the screen. The footage you are about to see was captured by the high-definition security lens mounted above the ATM on the northeast corner of 55th and Halsted. Let us review the events of that evening, precisely as they unfolded. Roy pressed a button. The video began to play. It was silent, but the clarity of the 4K lens left nothing to the imagination. The streetlights cast long shadows over the damp pavement of the intersection. At exactly 2 hours, 2 minutes, and 10 seconds, a silver 1998 Honda Civic entered the frame from the south. As the jury can see, Roy narrated, pausing the video just as the Civic reached the white line of the intersection. The vehicle comes to a complete, lawful stop. The turn signal is activated. The vehicle is positioned perfectly within its designated lane. Sergeant Miller, you testified under oath just 10 minutes ago that you observed my vehicle drifting erratically across the center line. Do you see any drifting in this footage? Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Camera angles can be highly deceptive. From our vantage point behind you, the driving appeared impaired. Fascinating, Roy replied dryly. He pressed play again. Let us observe your vantage point. 5 seconds later, the police cruiser entered the frame. It did not pull up behind the Honda. Instead, it accelerated rapidly from a side street, cutting across 2 lanes of traffic without using a turn signal, and aggressively boxed the Honda in against the curb. The cruiser's light bar flared to life in a blinding strobe of red and blue. A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Judge Patricia Carmichael leaned entirely over her mahogany bench, her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Now, Roy continued, his tone never rising, yet dominating every inch of the room. Watch the interaction. You testified that I was belligerent right out of the gate. You claimed I screamed obscenities and refused to exit the vehicle. On the screen, Officer Bradley Jenkins leaped out of the driver's side of the cruiser. He didn't approach the window to ask for a license and registration. Instead, he drew his baton, sprinted to the driver's door of the Honda, and yanked it open. Roy's figure could be seen inside, his hands immediately raised and pressed flat against the steering wheel in total compliance. Jenkins reached in, grabbed Roy by the collar of his shirt, and violently hurled him onto the wet asphalt. David Ross, the public defender, sitting at the defense table, dropped his pen, his mouth hung open. He looked from the screen to Roy, suddenly realizing the man sitting next to him was entirely unrecognizable from the helpless vagrant he had assumed him to be. "Does this depict a standard, lawful extraction, Sergeant?" Roy asked, freezing the frame on Jenkins's knee, driving into Roy's spine. You were tensing up," Miller stammered, his confident bluster evaporating into a pathetic, breathless wheeze. The suspect was resisting. "We used necessary force to gain compliance." "Compliance," Roy echoed, letting the word hang in the air like a death sentence. "Let us examine the exact moment you gained this compliance. And, more importantly, let us examine the arrival of the unregistered .38 caliber revolver." Roy fast-forwarded the footage by exactly 40 seconds. On screen, Roy was now handcuffed and pressed face first against the trunk of the Honda by Jenkins. Miller, meanwhile, walked out of frame toward the police cruiser. "Watch the bottom left corner," Roy instructed the jury. The jurors leaned forward as one unified organism. On the screen, Miller walked back into the frame. He was carrying his black tactical duty bag. He set it on the hood of the cruiser, unzipped a side compartment, and reached inside. When his hand emerged, his fingers were curled around a heavy, dark object. Miller glanced over his shoulder, checking to see if the street was empty before walking over to where Roy was pinned. With a casual, practiced flick of his wrist, Miller dropped the object onto the pavement near Roy's right foot. "Pause," Roy commanded the room. The image froze on the dark piece of metal resting on the asphalt. "Sergeant Miller, can you identify the object you just retrieved from your personal tactical bag and deposited at my feet?" Complete, suffocating silence blanketed courtroom 302. At the prosecution table, Jenkins looked like he had been struck by lightning. His face was the color of spoiled milk. ADA Hayes slowly sank into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. His career was flashing before his eyes. He had put a decorated officer on the stand, and that officer had just committed blatant, irrefutable perjury on the record. I don't." Miller's voice broke. Sweat poured down his temples, soaking the collar of his crisp blue uniform. "That video. It lacks context. It's doctored. He altered the footage." "Doctored?" Roy raised an eyebrow. "I subpoenaed the encrypted RAW file directly from Bank of America's regional security hub in Charlotte, North Carolina. The digital cryptographic hash matches the bank's internal ledger perfectly. I have the sworn affidavit of the bank's vice president of cybersecurity verifying its authenticity. Would you like me to enter that into evidence as well, or are you prepared to admit you planted a drop gun to justify a violent, racially motivated assault?" "Objection!" Hayes shrieked, jumping to his feet, his voice cracking in panic. "Your Honor, the state." The state was unaware. "We had no knowledge of." "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," Judge Carmichael roared, her voice echoing like a thunderclap. She slammed her gavel down so hard the wooden block splintered. She turned her furious gaze upon the witness stand. "Sergeant Miller, I will remind you that you are under penalty of perjury, a Class 3 felony in the state of Illinois. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." Miller looked at Jenkins. Jenkins looked at the door. There was nowhere to run. The trap had snapped shut, and the teeth were buried deep in their bones. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Miller whispered, staring a hole into the floorboards. "The state moves to immediately dismiss all charges against Mr. Jasson," ADA Hayes stammered, frantically packing his briefcase. He wanted nothing more than to flee the room, distance himself from the toxic fallout, and draft a resignation letter. "With prejudice, Your Honor. The state withdraws its case." "Not so fast, Mr. Hayes," Roy said. The courtroom froze. A defendant objecting to a full dismissal with prejudice was unheard of. David Ross reached up, desperately tugging at Roy's sleeve. "Roy, what are you doing? You won!" "Let them dismiss it. We can file a massive civil rights lawsuit tomorrow," you'll be a millionaire." Roy gently but firmly removed Ross's hand from his jacket. He didn't look like a man who had just won a lottery. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "I appreciate your diligence, David," Roy said quietly, "but my presence in this courtroom was never about a civil settlement." Roy turned to face Judge Carmichael. The deferential, polite tone he had used as a pro se defendant vanished entirely, replaced by an unmistakable cadence of federal authority. "Your Honor, I do not accept the state's dismissal because the state of Illinois no longer holds jurisdiction over this matter," Roy declared. Judge Carmichael blinked, bewildered. "Excuse me, Mr. Jasson. I am the presiding judge in this circuit. I determine jurisdiction." "With respect, Your Honor, you do not," Roy replied smoothly. He reached into the inner pocket of his frayed suit jacket. He didn't pull out a legal motion. He pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet and flipped it open. The golden shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the harsh fluorescent lights, gleaming like a beacon. Beside it was a stark, holographic identification card. "My name is Roy Jasson," he announced, his voice carrying to the very back row of the stunned gallery. "Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And this entire proceeding is part of a classified, multi-agency federal sting operation." A pin drop would have sounded like an explosion in the dead silence of the room. Officer Bradley Jenkins let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward until his spine hit the wooden railing separating the gallery. Sergeant Miller remained frozen on the witness stand, his eyes wide, his mind short-circuiting as the horrifying reality of his situation crushed the breath from his lungs. They hadn't just framed an innocent man. They had framed the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the United States. "Director?" Judge Carmichael whispered, her stern facade entirely crumbling. She looked at the gold shield, then up at the man wearing the thrift store suit. The commanding presence, the flawless grasp of police procedure, the encrypted digital evidence, it all suddenly made terrifying sense. For the past 14 months, Roy spoke, his voice ringing with cold, righteous fury. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has been secretly investigating the Chicago Police Department's 9th District. We received dozens of credible reports regarding a specialized patrol unit known internally as the Reapers, a unit that routinely engaged in racial profiling, illegal search and seizure, falsification of official records, and the systemic planting of narcotics and firearms on unarmed black men to inflate their arrest statistics. Roy slowly walked toward the prosecution table, his eyes locked onto Jenkins. The burly, arrogant cop was trembling violently, his hands shaking so hard they rattled against his duty belt. "We possessed the statistical data," Roy continued, "but we lacked the indisputable, on-the-ground evidence required to bypass the internal protections of the local police union. I required first-hand verification of the deprivation of civil rights under color of law. So, I took a leave of absence from Washington. I acquired a 1998 Honda Civic, and I spent 3 weeks driving through your patrol sector between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning, waiting for you to do exactly what you do best. You set us up," Miller croaked from the witness stand, his voice barely audible. "I offered you a canvas, Sergeant," Roy corrected him sharply. "You chose to paint a crime on it. Nobody forced you to switch off your body cameras. Nobody forced you to bypass the fleet motor pool. And nobody forced you to pull an untraceable weapon from your bag and drop it at my feet. You acted with absolute impunity, believing that my race, my battered vehicle, and my threadbare clothing made me a voiceless victim. You were wrong." Roy turned his gaze to the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom. He gave a sharp, single nod. The doors burst open. Half a dozen men and women wearing sharp, dark suits and tactical earpieces flooded into the aisle. The gold lettering on their navy blue windbreakers read FBI. Leading the pack was Special Agent Gregory Campbell, the assistant director in charge of the Chicago field office. The court bailiffs instinctively reached for their sidearms, but froze as Campbell flashed his badge, marching straight past the gallery and into the well of the court. "Director Jasson," Campbell said crisply, ignoring the stunned judge and the hyperventilating prosecutor. "The perimeter is secured. Arrest warrants have been executed simultaneously at the 9th District Precinct. We have the precinct captain and 4 other officers in custody." "Excellent work, Gregory." Roy nodded. He finally took off the oversized gray suit jacket, folding it neatly over the back of the defense chair. Beneath it, his posture was immaculate. He turned back to the terrified men who had laughed at him only an hour prior. "Officer Bradley Jenkins." "Sergeant Thomas Miller," Roy stated, stepping directly into their personal space. The scent of their fear was palpable. "You are hereby placed under federal arrest for violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You are also charged with federal perjury, conspiracy to commit civil rights abuses, and obstruction of justice." Agent Campbell stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy, stainless steel federal handcuffs from his belt. Jenkins finally broke. The arrogant swagger, the mocking smirks, the illusion of untouchable power, it all shattered in an instant. He dropped to his knees right there on the courtroom carpet, burying his face in his hands, openly sobbing. "Please, please, I have a family. Miller made me do it. He's the senior officer. I was just following his lead." "Shut up, Brad," Miller hissed, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and utter despair. He slumped over the witness stand, the fight completely draining out of his posture. He looked exactly like the broken, helpless men he had spent his entire career sending to prison. "Your families will be notified of your incarceration at the Metropolitan Correctional Center," Roy said, devoid of any sympathy. Agent Campbell, read them their rights and get them out of my sight. The heavy clack-clack of the federal handcuffs echoing in the silent courtroom sounded vastly different than the cuffs Roy had worn that morning. This time, the steel was binding the monsters, not the prey. As Campbell dragged the sobbing Jenkins and the defeated Miller toward the exit, Roy turned back to the bench. Judge Carmichael was staring at him, utterly speechless, her gavel forgotten on her desk. David Ross was clutching his chest, breathing heavily, looking at Roy as if he were a ghost. ADA Hayes looked as though he might faint. "I apologize for the disruption to your docket, Your Honor," Roy said politely, his tone returning to a calm, professional baseline. "The Department of Justice will forward the formal jurisdictional transfer paperwork to your clerk by the end of the business day. Have a pleasant afternoon." Without waiting for a response, Director Roy Jasson turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom. He left the threadbare thrift store suit jacket resting on the chair, a silent, haunting monument to the voiceless victims who would finally get their justice. The shockwave resulting from courtroom 302 did not merely ripple through the Chicago Police Department. It shattered the very foundation of the 9th District. By nightfall, the Dirksen Federal Courthouse was swarming with agents from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Bradley Jenkins and Thomas Miller were stripped of their silver badges, their service weapons, and their dignity. They were transported directly to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the towering, triangular federal prison looming over the Chicago Loop. They traded their crisp, tailored uniforms for the bright, humiliating orange of federal detainees. Because of their status as former law enforcement officers who had actively terrorized the local community, they could not be safely placed in the general population. They spent their days entirely isolated in 23-hour lockdown within the special housing unit, forced to listen to the muffled, echoing taunts of inmates they had once mercilessly abused. Karma did not just visit the 2 corrupt cops. It took up permanent residence in their lives. Jenkins, desperate to save his own skin, immediately attempted to turn state's evidence against Miller. He openly wept in the stark federal interrogation room, offering up years of planted evidence, stolen cash from crime scenes, and systemic civil rights violations. But the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, operating under direct, unyielding orders from Washington, refused the plea deal. The government already possessed the precinct ledger, the dashcam overrides, and the sworn testimonies of 13 other officers who had folded under the massive weight of federal pressure. Jenkins had nothing of value left to trade. 2 months later, the federal trial commenced. It was not held in the lenient, familiar territory of the county circuit, but under the unforgiving gaze of Chief Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer in federal court. Roy Jassen did not attend the proceedings in person. He had already returned to the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., his mission accomplished. Instead, he allowed the meticulously gathered digital evidence and the bank's irrefutable cryptographic hash logs to speak for themselves. The trial lasted exactly 4 days. The jury deliberated for barely 45 minutes. When the foreman read the guilty verdict, Jenkins collapsed forward into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably as his wife, sitting in the front row of the gallery, quietly stood up and walked out of the courtroom. She filed for divorce the very following morning, moving to freeze his remaining assets to protect their children from the impending avalanche of civil restitution lawsuits. Miller stood stoically, but the visible, violent tremor in his hands betrayed his broken spirit. Judge Pallmeyer did not mince words during the sentencing hearing. Citing the severe, racially motivated deprivation of constitutional rights under the color of law, she handed down a crushing mandate: 15 years in federal prison for Jenkins and 20 years for Miller, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. They were slated for immediate transfer to USP Terre Haute, a high-security federal penitentiary where their former titles would offer zero protection. The fallout catalyzed a massive, real-world shift. Triggered by Roy's unprecedented undercover operation, the United States Attorney General authorized a sweeping, historic consent decree over the entire Chicago Police Department. The legal decree forced mandatory federal oversight, the installation of unalterable, cloud-based body cameras, and the total dismantling of specialized, autonomous strike teams like the Reapers. The corrupt unit was completely liquidated. Over 30 wrongful convictions tied directly to Miller and Jenkins were successfully overturned within a year, freeing dozens of innocent men who had been swallowed by a broken system. Back in Washington, Director Roy Jassen stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive office, looking out over the sprawling expanse of Pennsylvania Avenue. He held a thick, leather-bound report detailing the final prison transfers of the disgraced 9th District officers. He had not undertaken the dangerous assignment for glory or political leverage. He had done it because he remembered what it felt like to be entirely voiceless. He remembered the neighborhood he grew up in, the heavy, oppressive fear of flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror, and the terrifying vulnerability of having your word mean absolutely nothing against a tarnished silver badge. He closed the file, setting it down on his expansive mahogany desk. The system was far from perfect, and the battle against institutional corruption was a grueling, endless marathon. But for the men and women of the South Side, the streets were just a little bit brighter. The wolves had been dragged out into the blinding light, and justice, cold, absolute, and unyielding, had finally been served. Roy Jassen proved that true power does not roar. It observes, calculates, and strikes with devastating precision. The arrogant predators of the 9th District learned too late that the most dangerous man in the room is often the quietest. Their badges could not shield them from a meticulously constructed trap. Justice prevailed, permanently stripping the corrupt of their hollow authority and restoring a fractured community's stolen dignity.